There are names in rock music that carry weight so heavy, so deeply embedded in the DNA of American culture, that simply hearing them sends electricity through the air. Van Halen is one of those names. For decades, it meant something almost mythological. A sound, a movement, a revolution in what 6 strings could accomplish in the hands of a genius. But what happens when that name belongs not just to a legend, but to a young man still figuring out who he is? What happens when the shadow cast by greatness falls over someone who never asked to stand inside it? That is the story of Wolfgang Van Halen, a story that is no longer about inheritance, but about transformation. And right now, the world is finally paying attention. Wolfgang Van Halen was born on March 16, 1991, in Santa Monica, California, the only child of rock royalty Eddie Van Halen and actress Valerie Bertinelli. From his very first breath, the world had already written a story for him. The son of the man who rewrote the rules of rock guitar, Wolfgang entered a universe already saturated with expectation. Cameras waited outside hospitals. Magazines speculated about his future before he could speak. The machinery of fame had already decided his destiny. Yet inside the walls of his family home, life was deliberately, purposefully different. Both Eddie and Valerie understood the dangers of letting celebrity raise a child. They chose instead to raise a human being first, and a musician second. If at all, Valerie Bertinelli has spoken openly in interviews over the years about her desire to give Wolfgang a grounded, normal upbringing. She structured their home around warmth rather than wealth, around family dinners rather than industry parties. Wolfgang himself has recalled in interviews that his childhood felt surprisingly ordinary. There were toys, cartoons, school, and laughter, not limousines and recording studios. His mother created a sanctuary from the storm of fame that constantly swirled around the Van Halen name. And while Eddie was many things to many people, a virtuoso, an icon, a celebrity, at home, he tried to be something simpler. He tried to be a father. Eddie Van Halen, despite his almost supernatural musical gifts, was by many accounts a quiet, even shy man in private settings. Those who knew him personally often described him as surprisingly gentle, introspective, and deeply loving toward his son. When Wolfgang was around 8 years old, Eddie handed him a pair of drumsticks, not a guitar. That decision was deliberate and telling. Rather than steering his son toward the instrument that had made Eddie a god among musicians, he started him somewhere more foundational. Rhythm, timing, discipline. He reportedly placed a stack of magazines on a table and told Wolfgang that if he could strike them consistently in time, that was the essence of drumming. It was an unconventional lesson, almost comically simple, but it revealed something important about Eddie as a parent. He wanted Wolfgang to understand music from the inside out, not just to copy what he saw his father do. Wolfgang took to it with a ferocity that surprised everyone around him. Within a relatively short period of time, he had moved from magazines to a real drum kit, spending hours alone in his room working through rhythms with a focus and determination that went far beyond what any parent might reasonably expect from a child that age. His uncle Alex Van Halen, the legendary drummer who had anchored Van Halen's sound for decades, was reportedly stunned when he first heard what his nephew could do. The talent was undeniable, but more importantly, the passion was real. This was not a boy performing because he was told to. This was a boy discovering something he genuinely loved. As Wolfgang moved into his teenage years, his musical curiosity expanded beyond the drum kit and crept toward the guitar. This was perhaps inevitable given his environment, but the way he approached it was entirely his own. He has been candid in various interviews about the fact that his father was not an effective teacher in any traditional sense. Eddie's genius was instinctive, almost impossible to break down into learnable steps. He played the way birds fly, not because he studied aerodynamics, but because it was simply what he did. For Wolfgang, watching his father play was simultaneously inspiring and frustrating. There was no roadmap to follow, no manual to consult. So he did what any determined teenager does when faced with a wall. He found his own way around it. He taught himself. He studied guitar tablature online, listened obsessively to bands like Blink-182 and System of a Down, absorbed sounds that were entirely outside the Van Halen universe, and slowly, painstakingly, developed a voice on the instrument that was authentically his own. He has stated in interviews with publications including Spin magazine that his chief concern during those formative years was avoiding imitation. He understood clearly that if he simply tried to sound like his father, the result would be an inferior copy, and an inferior copy of Eddie Van Halen was worse than nothing at all. Instead, he chased something that felt true to his own experience, his own emotional landscape, his own generation. Then came 2006, and with it a moment that would fundamentally alter the course of Wolfgang's life. Eddie Van Halen, who had spent years battling serious health challenges including oral cancer, found renewed energy and purpose in the idea of bringing Van Halen back on the road. A reunion tour was being planned, one that would reunite the classic lineup of Eddie, Alex, and original vocalist David Lee Roth. But there was a question of who would play bass. Longtime bassist Michael Anthony would not be part of the reunion. Eddie's solution was to invite his 15-year-old son to fill that role. The announcement was met with significant controversy among Van Halen's dedicated fanbase. Critics and fans alike questioned whether this was an act of genuine artistic merit or simply a father giving his son an unfair advantage. The criticism was loud, pointed, and at times deeply personal toward Wolfgang. He has spoken in subsequent years about how painful that period was. He was a teenager stepping into one of the most scrutinized positions in rock music, replacing a beloved musician who had been part of the band's identity for decades, and doing so while the entire world assumed he was there purely because of his last name. The pressure was immense. The doubt, both from outside and inside himself, was relentless, but Wolfgang showed up, night after night, and played. The 2007 to 2008 Van Halen reunion tour was by any commercial measure a massive success, grossing tens of millions of dollars and playing to sold-out arenas across North America. And while the critics had expected Wolfgang to be a liability, many were forced to acknowledge that he held his own. His presence on stage was steady, his playing solid, and his connection with his father visibly genuine. He was not Michael Anthony, and he never tried to be. He was Wolfgang Van Halen, learning his craft in the most demanding classroom imaginable. The experience left marks, though. Wolfgang has been honest about the psychological toll of those years. Being defined entirely in relation to someone else, being measured constantly against a standard you did not set and cannot control, takes something from a person. He absorbed a great deal of hostility from fans who felt he had displaced someone beloved, and that hostility lodged itself somewhere deep. Yet he kept going. When Van Halen returned in 2012 with their album A Different Kind of Truth, their first studio album in decades, Wolfgang was part of it, contributing not just his playing but his creative input as well. He was no longer just a teenager along for the ride. He was a working member of a legendary band. But even that was not enough for him. Around 2013, Wolfgang began quietly pursuing a parallel musical life. One that had nothing to do with Van Halen and everything to do with who he was becoming as an independent artist. He joined Tremonti, the band led by guitarist Mark Tremonti of Creed and Alter Bridge. The opportunity allowed him to exist, even briefly, in a space where he was judged purely on his musical contributions rather than on the circumstances of his birth. He has described joining the band with very little preparation, learning their entire setlist in a single night and going on tour the very next day. It was, by any measure, a bold and confident move. He recorded 2 albums with them, Cauterize and Dust, and for the first time experienced what it felt like to be a musician first and a famous person's son second. Then came 2020, and the world broke. Eddie Van Halen had been battling cancer for years, a battle that had gone through periods of hope and devastation in equal measure. On October 6, 2020, at the age of 65, Eddie Van Halen passed away at a hospital in Santa Monica, California. The outpouring of grief from the global music community was immediate and overwhelming. For the world, it was the loss of an icon. For Wolfgang, it was the loss of his father. Nothing that had come before, not the criticism, not the pressure, not the years of proving himself, had prepared him for this. Wolfgang has spoken about his grief with remarkable openness and vulnerability in the years since. In interviews conducted in the aftermath of his father's death, he has not hidden behind the armor of celebrity or retreated into silence. He talked about the rawness of the pain, about days when getting out of bed felt impossible, about the specific ache of losing someone who was simultaneously a parent and a symbol. He acknowledged being pulled toward isolation, toward the kind of darkness that grief invites when it goes unaddressed. And he spoke about what kept him from surrendering to it. His deep conviction that his father would not have wanted him to disappear. That Eddie Van Halen, who had fought to stay alive, who had fought to keep making music through decades of physical and personal struggle, would have been frustrated, maybe even angry, to see his son give up. So Wolfgang did the only thing that made sense. He made music. In 2021, he released his debut solo album under the name Mammoth WVH. The title was deliberate and layered with meaning. Mammoth had been the name of his father's very first band, long before Van Halen existed, back when Eddie and Alex were still teenagers in Pasadena playing clubs and dances. By reclaiming that name, Wolfgang was doing something deeply intentional. He was honoring where his family's musical story began while announcing that a new chapter was being written. And he wrote every single note of it himself. Every instrument on the record, drums, bass, guitar, keyboards, and vocals, was performed by Wolfgang alone. It was an extraordinary creative statement, a deliberate act of total ownership over something that was completely, unmistakably his. The album's lead single, Distance, was written as a direct tribute to Eddie Van Halen. The song is emotionally raw, built around the specific grief of watching a parent deteriorate and the helplessness of not being able to close the gap between love and loss. It connected with listeners in a way that surprised even Wolfgang. The single reached #1 on Billboard's Hard Rock Airplay chart and earned him a Grammy nomination for Best Rock Song at the 2022 Grammy Awards. He attended the ceremony with his mother Valerie and his then-girlfriend Andrea,